My name is Catherine Lawson, and my husband had just been buried. The sky above the cemetery was the same color as the suit he wore the day we married. Dove gray, still, with the sun trying to break through, but never quite managing it. We stood in a circle around the coffin, my children flanking me like sentries, though none of us touched. The hymns had been sung, the minister's voice had gone quiet, and the hush that followed was the kind that makes your chest ache. The kind that leaves room for everything unsaid. 42 years. That's how long I'd been his wife. We built a life together, messy, flawed, real. We had weathered late nights with sick children, laughter in grocery store aisles, silent dinners after long arguments. He wasn't perfect. Neither was I. But we were us. And now it was only me. People began to drift away, murmuring condolences as they passed. Some touched my hand. Some didn't know what to say, so they just looked down and walked faster. I stood beside the casket, fingers clasped, remembering the last time I held his hand, the way his grip weakened near the end, the way he blinked 3 times before slipping into stillness. And then I felt her presence beside me. Melissa, my daughter-in-law. She'd been wearing black like the rest of us, but not mourning. Her shoes were too clean, her lipstick too red. She stood close enough for her perfume to wrap around me like smoke, sweet, synthetic, overbearing. She leaned in under the guise of comfort. From a distance, it would have looked like a moment of family unity. But then she whispered into my ear, so softly that only I could hear it. Well, at least now there's room to breathe. I didn't turn to look at her. I didn't respond. I just blinked once, twice, 3 times, just like he had. And I understood then, in that moment, that this wasn't just grief I was standing in. It was the beginning of something else, something sharp. Something that would not be buried alongside him, because Melissa hadn't just mocked a widow. She'd declared something far worse. She'd mistaken my silence for surrender, my composure for weakness, and the only mistake bigger than that was making it in front of a woman with nothing left to lose. She came into our lives with a smile so perfect it felt rehearsed. Melissa wore charm like it was tailored. Clean lines, polished shoes, a voice always half a step too sweet. The first time we met, she shook my hand like we were at a job interview. Her eye contact was unwavering, her compliments carefully chosen. "You must be the one who raised James so well," she said, laying the praise between us like a satin napkin. I remember wondering, even then, how someone so young could already be that practiced. James looked smitten. He always fell hard. And I, of course, said all the right things. I welcomed her. I smiled back. I set an extra place at the table and tried not to notice the way she scanned our home like she was cataloging the furniture. They married quickly. Too quickly, I thought. But I kept that thought to myself. It wasn't my place to interfere, or so I told myself. And James was an adult. I told myself he'd chosen well. At first, she kept her distance with the finesse of someone polite on paper. She texted occasionally, always on behalf of James. "We can't make it this weekend, but we're thinking of you. We'd love to come by, but James has work." The messages were always pleasant, but he stopped calling on his own. I noticed the shift when James stopped asking me for advice about the little things, the car trouble, the rent increase, the burnt pasta. He started speaking in polished phrases like someone editing himself in real time. When he brought Melissa over for dinner one winter, she complimented the food with that same too smooth smile, then offered to bring a few recipes next. Time, because she had a better way of making roast chicken. She didn't say my way was bad. She didn't have to. Over the years, she threaded herself between us, subtly, strategically. When they bought a house, James said they didn't need help moving. Melissa's family had it covered. When I suggested a weekend visit, it was Melissa, who already had plans. When I asked if they needed anything during the pandemic, the answer came delayed. Through her, polite but closed. There were small things too. My birthday card, once handwritten by James, now printed in gold foil and signed in both their names. A Mother's Day bouquet delivered from a service I'd never heard of. His handwriting disappeared, and with it so did the son I once knew. Don't blame her for everything. That would be too simple. But it became clear over time that she was not interested in sharing him. She wanted full control of the narrative, of the finances, of the space he used to reserve for me. She didn't just marry my son. She replaced his reflection with her own. It started slow, like most things do when they're meant to go unnoticed. After his retirement, Richard spent more time at home, which I'd secretly looked forward to. I imagined lazy breakfasts in the sunroom, his humming from the garden, crossword puzzles traded between us like quiet love notes. But instead, the house began to shift, not with him, but around him. Melissa visited more often, sometimes with James, sometimes alone, always with a purpose. She brought spreadsheets, renovation ideas, new tech subscriptions. "It's just easier if we streamline things," she'd say, tapping on her tablet. "You two don't need to. Worry yourselves with the little stuff." It was never phrased as a takeover, just help. One morning, I found her in our kitchen rearranging the pantry. I hadn't asked. No one had. She smiled and said, "You'll thank me. It's more functional this way." I never found the tea tins after that. Then came the financial suggestions, investments, transfers, a joint account that would make inheritance easier later. Richard, always trusting, agreed without much thought. He had a soft spot for Melissa, said she was modern, said she had ideas. What he didn't see was how those ideas came at the cost of my voice. When I'd suggest something, a vacation, a home project, even something as small as buying a new kettle, she'd offer a newer version, a better way. And slowly, Richard stopped backing me. Not maliciously, just habitually. Even our gatherings began to look different. Melissa took over holidays, hosting them at her house and delegating tasks like a corporate manager. I was asked to bring a salad, that was all. Old friends stopped calling. Some tried, but Melissa often intercepted. "Catherine's just so tired these days," she'd say on speakerphone as I walked into the room. "We'll reach out when things settle." But things never did, and eventually they stopped trying. One afternoon, I came home to find the living room redecorated. Our armchair, the one Richard and I bought the year James was born, was gone. "We donated it," Melissa said. "It was falling apart." It hadn't been, and in that moment, standing in a space I no longer recognized, I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself until then. Grief doesn't always begin with death. Sometimes, it begins the first time you speak, and no one hears you. And sometimes the mourning starts while the person you love is still sitting across the room. It was a Tuesday. I remember because it rained, a soft, soaking kind of rain that tapped against the windows like it had nowhere else to be. Richard was upstairs resting. His breathing had grown shallow in recent weeks, but he insisted on staying in our bedroom, surrounded by the walls that had held our entire marriage. I was in the kitchen folding towels when I heard the front door creak open. I didn't call. Out. They didn't expect me to. Melissa's voice came first, low and clipped. "She'll be fine. She always adjusts. That's her thing, pretending she understands what's going on." James answered, quieter. "It's still her house, Mel." "For now," she said. I heard the sound of her heels on the wood floor, pacing. "Your father said he wanted things simple. This is what simple looks like. Clean, divided, modern. She'll get the sentiment. We'll get the security." A pause. Then James again, this time with something harder in his tone. "You pushed him into it." "No," Melissa said quickly. I reminded him of reality. She doesn't handle finances. She hasn't touched an account in decades. Do you want her managing a trust or figuring out taxes? Honestly, James, she still writes checks at the grocery store. They both laughed, a small, knowing laugh. The kind you reserve for someone you think won't ever hear it. I stood frozen, towel still in hand. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood something vital in that moment. This wasn't about efficiency. It wasn't about helping. It was about replacement. They were rewriting our legacy while the man I loved slept upstairs. Still warm, still breathing, still calling me his girl when he stirred in the middle of the night. I backed away from the kitchen, door before the conversation could continue. I didn't want to hear more, not because I couldn't bear it, but because I knew enough. The mask Melissa wore, the charming daughter-in-law, the helpful strategist, the one who always smiled at the right time, had cracked. And behind it was calculation, not malice, not fire, something colder. She didn't hate me. She simply didn't see me, not as a mother-in-law, not as a person, just as an obstacle. Something to be managed, maneuvered, erased. I folded the towel slowly and placed it on the counter. There are moments when grief begins before the body is buried, and sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive in a scream. It arrives in a whisper through the walls you paid to build. It began with the lilies. I had asked for white roses, quiet, dignified, the kind Richard brought home every year on our anniversary. But when I arrived at the chapel that morning, it was lilies. Stark, showy things that filled the air with a sweetness that didn't belong. Melissa stood near the front pew arranging them, acting like it was her own husband in the casket. When I opened my mouth to speak, she looked over her shoulder and said, "Lilies are more traditional." I thought you'd agree. I didn't answer. There didn't seem to be room anymore for what I wanted. Not even in grief. The program, too, had changed. The hymn Richard and I had chosen years ago, "Be Still, My Soul," was missing. Replaced by something newer, something Melissa said would uplift the mood. She told me this as she handed me a glossy pamphlet already printed with her name listed as family speaker. I blinked at the ink like it might vanish if I stared long enough. She spoke just before the final prayer. Her voice was practiced, perfectly paced, with pauses in all the right places. She told stories that sounded intimate, but were really surface level. Anecdotes. Richard liked Sudoku. Richard loved red wine. Richard used to hum when he worked in the garden. It wasn't that the words were wrong. It was that they weren't hers to say. When she finished, she folded the speech in half, kissed it, and laid it gently on the casket. Then, subtle as breath, she turned toward me with the corners of her mouth curled, just slightly. Not grief, not solidarity. Victory. In that moment, the grief inside me sharpened, turned into something colder. Something that burned low and quiet, like coals under ash. This wasn't about a woman mourning her father-in-law. This was a woman laying claim to his memory, to his name, to the space that should have been mine to fill. She hadn't just stood beside me in that pew. She had slowly, methodically pushed me out of it. I sat through the final song with my hands folded and my eyes dry. Not because I wasn't grieving, but because I suddenly understood that mourning alone would not be enough. She had buried him beside me, but made it clear. She never saw me as the one he was buried with. I hadn't stepped into Richard's study since the morning of the funeral. The room still smelled like him. Leather, tobacco from a pipe he never quite gave up, and the faint trace of that sandalwood soap he always bought in bulk. The desk sat untouched, its surface a careful mess of paperweights, golf tournament trophies, and pens that still worked if you shook them. I wasn't looking for anything. Not really. I think I just needed to feel near him again. To sit in his chair, run my fingers over the grain of the wood he once polished every spring. But something pulled me toward the drawer on the right, the one he used to keep locked. He'd joked once that it was where he stored state secrets, but I knew better. Receipts, insurance papers, bits and pieces of a man's life no one else bothered to manage but him. The lock clicked open with barely any resistance. And inside, tucked beneath a folded newspaper from the week James was born, was a plain envelope. No name, no seal. Just heavy paper and the slight indent of his handwriting pressing through the flap. I opened it slowly. Inside was a letter. Written in Richard's familiar looping cursive, the ink slightly faded in places. Along with it, a typed sheet listing. Bank accounts, trust fund details, and a single brass key taped to the corner. The letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say everything, but you deserve to know I didn't forget you." I never did. I sat down hard in the desk chair, the letter trembling in my hands. He went on. "I know Melissa. I've watched her, the same way you have. I've seen how she speaks over you, how she reshapes things in her image. You never complained. Not once, but I noticed. I should have said something sooner. I didn't. That's on me, but this is yours. The trust in your name. The secondary account no one else knows about. The safety deposit box. It holds everything she didn't count on you having. Everything I kept aside for the woman who built this life with me. Quietly, bravely, fully. I blinked, trying to keep the tears from smudging the ink. He hadn't told anyone, not even James. He'd written this in private, planned it without ceremony. Because that's who he was. The man who fixed broken chairs before anyone noticed they were wobbling. The man who chose quiet action over loud affection. He didn't leave me nothing. He left me proof that I had been seen, that I had been loved, that somewhere beneath all the noise, the woman being quietly erased still mattered to the one person who truly knew her. The key was cool and small in my palm, like something out of a different life. I held it for a moment before sliding it into the pocket of my coat, unsure what I was walking toward, but certain that whatever it was, Melissa hadn't planned for it. The safety deposit box was at the bank Richard and I had used since we were first married. The receptionist still remembered my name. That felt strange, like some quiet remnant of a world where I hadn't yet been erased. When the box was brought to the small viewing room, I hesitated. Just for a moment. The kind of pause that happens when you realize a door is about to open. That won't close the same way again. Then I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked folders, each one labeled in Richard's tidy, deliberate script. I recognized the faded edge of his will, except this wasn't the version Melissa had arranged to be read. This one was newer, dated just 6 months prior, and it told a different story. The trust he mentioned in the letter wasn't symbolic, it was real. It had been structured specifically in my name, independent of any marital entanglements or next of kin. Loopholes. The funds weren't extravagant, but they were substantial, enough to free me from dependence. Enough to re-establish autonomy. There were property records, too. The lake house. The one Melissa had suggested would be better sold to free up resources. Richard hadn't sold it. He'd placed it under a private title, mine. There was even a handwritten note tucked inside the deed. For peace, when peace is hard to come by. I sat there, surrounded by cold paper and warm proof, and felt something unexpected bloom inside me. Not rage, not even triumph, just relief. The kind that comes when the noise quiets and the story begins to rewrite itself in your own language. Melissa hadn't known about any of this. That much was obvious. Her face at the funeral had been too relaxed, too assured. She had thought the narrative was sealed, that her edits were permanent. But what she didn't know was that Richard had been writing in the margins all along. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was leverage. And in the quiet light of that windowless room, with the thick weight of truth resting in my lap, I finally felt something shift. For the first time in years, the balance had changed, and it was in my favor. The invitation was handwritten. Just a short note tucked into Melissa's mailbox. Tea on Thursday, 3 p.m., just the two of us. Catherine, I brewed chamomile. Not for its calm, but for its clarity. It was the tea Richard used to make when he needed to think, when words got tangled and silence had to do the talking. I set the table with our good china, white porcelain with blue trim, the kind Melissa once called quaint. I didn't bother to correct her then. Today, I wouldn't need to. She arrived on time, in a sleek blazer and with that smile that didn't reach her eyes. Catherine, she said as she stepped inside, voice as smooth as her heels across the tile. I wasn't sure I'd hear from you. I imagine you weren't, I replied softly, leading her into the kitchen. The tea was already steeped, the cups already poured. We sat. I offered her sugar. She declined. The silence stretched, just long enough for her to grow curious, suspicious. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a photocopy, neat and deliberate. I placed it between us, face up. The heading read, Irrevocable Trust Agreement. Catherine. Lawson, sole beneficiary. She didn't touch it. But her eyes snapped to it like a wire pulled taut. I found this after the funeral, I said, stirring my tea. Richard left it for me, along with the keys, along with the truth. Melissa's smile faltered. I thought it was time you knew. She tried to recover, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, let out a short breath through her nose. I'm not sure I understand what this has to do with me. I tilted my head, almost amused. That's the thing, it doesn't. Not anymore. The room was still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to quiet itself for the moment. I'm not here to fight you, I continued, or to make a scene. I just wanted to look you in the eye, before things begin to shift. Her jaw tensed. She reached for her teacup, then changed her mind. You should be more careful, I said gently, about who you underestimate. Then I smiled, just a little, and took a slow sip of my tea. It tasted like memory, like quiet strength, like the first moment in a very long time where I felt entirely in control. The ripple came fast. By the following Monday, Melissa had filed a petition to contest the trust, claimed confusion, miscommunication, that Richard hadn't been of sound mind, that I had manipulated the situation during his final weeks. She never said it directly, but the implication was clear. She expected me to flinch, to fold under the weight of accusation, of public mess. But I didn't. Instead, I called Mr. Archer. He'd been our family's attorney for nearly 3 decades, sharp-eyed, quiet-spoken, and loyal in the way that only time earns. He remembered the day Richard added the codicil to his will, remembered Melissa's name being intentionally omitted from certain clauses, remembered Richard's insistence that things be made right before it was too late. Mr. Archer handled everything. The letters were sent. The court filing was swift, and with the documents from the safety deposit box, the timeline was airtight. Melissa tried to object to the property claim. We presented the deed. She challenged the trust. We showed the notarized documents, signed, and witnessed, all legal and binding. She requested access to frozen accounts Richard had once jointly listed under family management. But with a single motion, Mr. Archer froze those assets under judicial review, pending outcome. The outcome was never in question. The court upheld everything, every line Richard had drawn, every protection he had quietly placed in my name. Melissa's face in the courtroom was unreadable, like stone left out in the sun. Not rage, not even defeat. Just the slow realization that the map she'd drawn in pencil had been overwritten, in ink, by a hand she thought was already gone. She didn't speak to me afterward, didn't look at me when she left the building, but I watched her heels echo down the marble steps, the sharpness of each step just slightly dulled. I thought it would feel like victory, but it didn't. It felt like repair, not to punish her, not to strip her of what she thought she'd won, but to remind myself that memory doesn't have to hurt to be true. That legacy can be chosen, protected, defended, and that even when people try to write you out of the story, you can still turn the page and find your name etched clearly at the top. The first whispers came from the garden club. Margaret Bailey called to say she'd heard the whole thing from her sister, whose daughter happened to be in real estate law. I always knew Melissa was a bit too modern, she said, pausing just long enough for the word to sting. But it didn't sting anymore. Not like it used to. By the end of the month, the local paper ran a quiet piece in the society section. The headline read, "Widow of Richard Lawson reclaims family estate following disputed will." They didn't name Melissa. They didn't need to. In a town like ours, omission speaks louder than print. The invitations returned. Luncheons, teas, community. Events, I went to a few, skipped most, not out of bitterness, just clarity. I'd learned that not every room needed my presence, and not every silence required my filling. But there was one event I attended with purpose: the annual charity auction for the Veterans Hospital. Richard supported it every year, quietly, generously. He never liked credit, but he always signed the checks. That evening, I arrived with one item in hand: his grandfather's watch, a brass Hamilton World War II issue, still ticking. The one he wore only on Remembrance Day, and the day James was born. I had it polished, boxed in velvet, and donated anonymously. But word spread. By the time the auctioneer lifted it onto the stand, a hush fell over the room. Everyone recognized it. The bids came quickly. Not out of greed, but reverence. It sold for nearly triple its value, the proceeds gifted to the ward that had cared for Richard's own brother before he passed. I didn't make a speech. Didn't take a bow. I simply stood near the back, hands clasped, and watched a piece of him move forward in the world the way he would have wanted. Quiet dignity. That was his legacy. And now, mine. Not loud, not bitter. Just a steady reclaiming of place, of memory, of self. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like something lost. I felt like something found. The cemetery was quiet that morning, overcast, with a light breeze that stirred the tall grass and made the wind chimes near the gate sing a lonely note. I parked by the oak. The one Richard used to joke was older than our entire family tree. He always liked coming here even before he was gone. Said it was peaceful. Said it reminded him that life didn't need to be loud to be meaningful. I walked the path slowly, each step soft over gravel and damp soil. My shoes sank slightly, but I didn't mind. It felt right to move gently here. His grave was simple, just how he wanted it. Richard Allen Lawson, beloved husband, father, friend. No flourishes. No quotes. Just the truth, carved in stone. I stood for a long time before speaking. Let the wind carry a few of my silences first. Then, with a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, I reached into my coat and pulled out the letter. The one he left me, folded along its creases, worn now from the number of times I'd read it when I couldn't sleep. I knelt and placed it at the base of the stone, anchoring it with a smooth river stone from our garden. He'd once told me it was his favorite. I thought she won, I said softly. For a while I really did. I traced the lettering on his name with my fingers. But she never saw you, not really. Not the way I did. Not the man who fixed broken fences and remembered anniversaries without reminders. Not the man who brewed tea when my hands were too tired to grip the kettle. Not the man who held my fears as if they were precious. A gust of wind passed, and a few dry leaves stirred around my feet. She wore the title. But she was never your widow. My voice didn't break. It didn't need to. You didn't leave me alone, Richard. You left me the truth. And that's something no one can take. I pressed my hand to the headstone one last time. Then I stood, smoothed the front of my coat, and walked back the way I came, lighter than when I arrived, because I wasn't saying goodbye. I was saying thank you. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, casting gentle shadows. Over the floor of my study, the same study Melissa once insisted was cluttered with relics. Now it was mine again, fully, quietly, and without argument. The photo of Richard and I at the lake rested back in its rightful place on the mantel. His smile in it was crooked, his hat askew. I remember I was the one behind the camera that day, telling him to stop squinting into the sun. He never did listen, not when he was happy. The room smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish, familiar, lived in. Every surface held a memory she had tried to box away. Every frame she'd once called outdated now stood tall, unbothered. I sat with a cup of tea. Chamomile again. Always chamomile when I need to see things clearly. The fire crackled, more for company than for warmth. Across from me, the desk bore the final folder from Mr. Archer. Everything was settled now. The trust secured, the titles transferred. Even the charitable foundation Richard and I had dreamed of starting was underway. There would be no more contests, no more performances, no more pretending. I reached for the drawer, opened it slowly, and retrieved the smallest item in it. Richard's silver cufflink, the one he lost the match to years ago. I'd found it in the lining of his old coat after the funeral. Somehow just one. It was fitting, really. One was all I needed. I set it on the table beside my tea, a quiet reminder. I thought of Melissa, though not unkindly. I wondered if she ever truly understood what legacy meant. Not the wealth, not the control, but the echo a person leaves in A room when they're no longer in it. Richard left kindness, loyalty, a steady hand, and I finally remembered mine. I looked out the window, where the garden had begun to bloom again after its winter sleep. The roses were rising, the lavender swaying, and in that calm, my voice found words I hadn't yet said out loud. They thought inheritance meant power, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. But mine was knowing exactly when to stop forgiving and start remembering who I am. And I did. Finally, I did.